the decision Emily Hargrove was about to make. Her fingers trembled as they gripped the handle of her worn leather purse, the same one her mother used before she left, taking with her all the dreams the family once had. Chicago stretched out before her like a giant of glass and steel, indifferent to the despair of a 4-year-old woman carrying the weight of 2,000 lives on her shoulders. The driver dropped her off in front of the Imperial Tower Hotel, an imposing skyscraper that seemed to judge her every step with its massive golden revolving door. Emily took a deep breath, smelling the rain mixed with the expensive perfume wafting from the lobby. Her simple boots squeaked against the polished marble as she walked toward the elevators. Each step echoed like a reminder of how far she was from home. 3 weeks ago, everything had collapsed. Hargrove Manufacturing, the factory that had sustained the small town of Oak Ridge for over 50 years, was on the brink of bankruptcy. Her father's former partner, Victor Langford, had embezzled millions in a fraudulent scheme that left the company bleeding debts and lawsuits. Her father, Robert Hargrove, a man with graying hair and calloused hands, now spent sleepless nights sitting at the kitchen table, staring at stacks of papers that no longer made sense. "Emily, I failed you. I failed everyone," he had said. His voice broken, his eyes red from crying. She held his hands, feeling the roughness of the skin that had once built everything from scratch. "No, Dad, there's still a chance." And that's why she was here. Alexander Kane. The name sounded like a death sentence. A ruthless billionaire known for buying struggling companies and turning them into empires or completely destroying them, depending on his mood. He was the last hope, the only person with enough capital to save Hargrove Manufacturing before the banks foreclosed on the debts and thousands of families were left without a livelihood. The elevator rose in silence. Each floor, a reminder that she was moving further from solid ground. 23rd floor. The door opened to a hallway lined with dark wood and soft lighting. Her steps sank into the thick carpet as she looked for suite 2307. When she knocked on the door, she didn't expect him to open it himself. Alexander Kane was exactly what the photos suggested, and worse, tall, broad-shouldered, impeccable black suit that cost more than she made in a year. But it was his eyes that disarmed her. Gray as steel, piercing, calculating, he looked her up and down, not with lust, but with the coldness of someone assessing an asset. "Miss Hargrove," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "Come in." The suite was absurdly luxurious. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city lit up by the storm. There was a bottle of champagne in an ice bucket, 2 crystal glasses, and a leather sofa that looked like it had never been used. Everything there screamed power, control, distance. "Sit down," he ordered, pointing to an armchair in front of a coffee table. He sat on the sofa himself, crossing his legs with an infuriating naturalness. Emily obeyed, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled from her bag the folder with the company documents, balance sheets, projections, contracts, everything organized, everything desperate. "Mr. Kane, I've read everything," he interrupted, waving his hand. "Your father was an idiot to trust Langford. The company is broke. The assets don't even cover half the debts. And you want me to invest how much again?" $12 million. Emily swallowed hard. 15 to pay off the debts and restructure production. "With a 5-year plan, we can." "We can." "Nothing, Miss Hargrove." He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her like a predator. "I don't do charity, and your company isn't worth 15 million. It's not even worth 5. The silence was brutal. Emily felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. "Then why did you call me here?" she asked, her voice coming out firmer than she expected. Alexander smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile that makes your stomach turn. "Because there's something you can offer that's worth much more than 12 million. Emily frowned, confused. He stood up, walking to the window, hands in his pockets. The city lights illuminated his profile, making him even more intimidating. "You," he said simply. The air seemed to leave her lungs. "I don't understand." He turned, staring at her with a coldness that froze her blood. "One night with me, for as many nights as I want for a month. In return, I save your company. I inject the necessary capital. Complete restructuring. Your town doesn't lose a single job." Emily felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. She stood up, stumbling, grabbing onto the back of the armchair. You're asking me to—" "I'm making a business proposal," he said, his voice emotionless. "You have something I want. I have something you need. It's as simple as that. Simple, Her voice came out in a strangled whisper. "You're asking me to sell myself?" "No." He took a step toward her, and Emily backed away. "I'm asking you to make a choice. 2,000 people are going to lose everything. Or you spend a month with me, and they keep their lives." She shook her head, tears finally escaping. "You're a monster." "Maybe." He picked up a business card from the table and held it out to her. "But I'm the only monster willing to help. Think carefully, Miss Hargrove. You have 48 hours. After that, the offer expires." Emily grabbed the card with trembling hands, turning toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back, her eyes burning with anger and despair. "I will never accept this. Never." Alexander didn't respond. He just watched as she left, slamming the door behind her. But he knew by the way she held on to the card. He knew by the desperation in her eyes she would come back, and when she did, he would have won. Emily ran down the hallway, suffocated, tears blurring her vision. As the elevator descended, when the doors opened on the ground floor, she practically stumbled out. Ignoring the curious looks from the doorman, the rain was still falling, drenching her as she walked aimlessly through the streets of Chicago. Alexander Kane's business card burning in her pocket like a death sentence. The train back to Oak Ridge seemed slower than ever. Emily pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching the landscape shift from gray skyscrapers to open, silent fields. Each mile that took her away from Chicago should have brought relief, but all she felt was a suffocating tightness in her chest, as if something heavy was crushing her lungs. Alexander Kane's business card was folded in her jacket pocket. She hadn't thrown it away. She couldn't, even hating every letter printed on that piece of paper. His name, the private number, the elegant font that seemed to mock her misery. Something stopped her from destroying it. 48 hours. The words echoed in her mind like a ticking bomb. 48 hours to decide whether she would sell her dignity, her body, her soul, in exchange for saving people who didn't even know about the sacrifice she was considering making. When the train finally stopped at the small Oak Ridge station, the sun was already setting, painting the sky orange and purple. Emily stepped off with wobbly legs, smelling the familiar scent of cut grass and pine trees that had always made her feel at home. But now everything seemed different, tainted. She walked through the narrow streets of the town, passing Mrs. Whitaker's bakery, which still opened at 5 inches the morning every day. Old Hank's auto shop, the elementary school where she herself had studied. Every corner, every familiar face, every shy smile from neighbors waving at her. Everything seemed to silently beg, "Save us, please." Emily quickened her pace, unable to bear the looks. When she reached the family home, a modest 2-story building with peeling paint and a garden her mother had once tended with such care, she found her father sitting on the porch, a cup of cold coffee in his hands. Robert Hargrove looked up when he saw her. The hope that shone in his eyes almost destroyed Emily. "So?" he asked, his voice rough from smoking. "Is he going to help?" Emily climbed the steps slowly, sitting beside him on the wooden bench that creaked under the weight of years of memories. "He said he needs to think about it." She lied, looking away. "I have to call him in 2 days." Her father's face fell, but he nodded, placing his trembling hand over hers. "You did what you could, sweetheart. I'm proud of you." Those words were like knives. Proud. If he knew what Alexander had proposed, would he still say that? If he knew his daughter was considering, really considering, prostituting herself for an entire month, would he still look her in the eye? That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in her childhood bedroom, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house, the dripping faucet in the bathroom, her father's restless footsteps pacing the living room, the wind banging against the old windows. At 3:00 the morning, she gave up trying to sleep. She put on a hoodie and went out the back door. Walking through the deserted streets of Oak Ridge to the factory, Hargrove Manufacturing was silent, its huge metal doors locked, the windows dark. But Emily knew every inch of that place. She had grown up playing among the machines when her father took her to work on weekends. She knew the smell of oil and steel, the roar of the engines, the pride on the workers' faces. When a new batch was completed, she placed her hand on the cold door, closing her eyes. 2,000 people. They weren't just numbers. They were faces. Ben, the production supervisor, who had 3 kids and a wife with cancer. Laura from accounting, who saved every penny to pay for her daughter's college. Young Jake, recently hired, who had finally managed to move out of his alcoholic mother's house. They all depended on this place, and now they all depended on her. Emily pulled her phone from her pocket with trembling hands. It was 20 inches the morning. She looked at Alexander's card, the letters smudged from the moisture of her sweaty hands. Call me when you're ready. She dialed the number before she could regret it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Miss Hargrove. His voice sounded clear without a trace of sleep, as if he'd been waiting. I thought it would take longer. Emily closed her eyes, feeling tears slide down her cheeks. Her voice failed. She took a deep breath, gripping the phone so hard her fingers turned white. I accept. Silence on the other end. Then a sigh that seemed almost satisfied. Smart, he said. I knew you'd make the right decision. This isn't right, she whispered, her voice breaking. None of this is right. Maybe not, Alexander replied, his voice as cold as the night air. But it's necessary. Tomorrow night? 8. Same hotel. Same suite. Don't be late. Wait, and Miss Hargrove, he paused. Come prepared. This won't be easy for either of us. The call dropped. Emily let the phone slip from her hand, falling onto the wet grass. She sat there on the cold ground, hugging her knees, sobbing silently as the reality of what she'd just done swallowed her whole. She had sold herself. For a month, her body would no longer be hers. It would belong to a man she barely knew, a man who saw her as a transaction, a property, a means to an end. When the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Emily finally stood up. Her clothes were soaked with dew. Her body ached from the cold, but she felt a strange numbness, as if she had left a part of herself there. Sitting on that wet grass, she returned home in silence, climbed the stairs without making a sound, and locked herself in her room. She needed a shower. She needed to get dressed. She needed to prepare because in less than 24 hours she would be in Chicago again. And this time there would be no turning back. In the dresser drawer, she found a simple dress her mother had given her years ago. Black, discreet, with an elegant cut she'd never had occasion to wear. She ran her fingers over the soft fabric, imagining what her mother would say if she were alive. If she would tell her to run, if she would tell her to fight, or if she would say that sometimes love requires sacrifices that no one else needs to know about. Emily carefully folded the dress and placed it in her small suitcase. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, looking out the window at the sleeping town, and waited for time to pass. Because somewhere deep in her chest, where anger mixed with fear, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Alexander Kane might have bought her body, but he would never have her soul. The trip back to Chicago was a blur of landscapes. Emily barely registered. Each heartbeat seemed to echo the same question. What are you doing? What are you doing? But she already knew the answer. She was doing what needed to be done, even if it meant breaking herself apart inside. When the taxi stopped in front of the Imperial Tower Hotel, night had already fallen over the city. The golden lights of the lobby gleamed like a glittering trap, inviting and dangerous at the same time. Emily paid the driver with trembling hands, holding her small suitcase as if it were a shield. Badian, she looked at the watch on her wrist, a gift from her father when she turned 18. Tidam Wusharfen. She still had 8 minutes. 8 minutes of freedom before crossing the line that separated who she was from, who she was about to become. She took a deep breath, feeling the cold night air fill her lungs, and walked in. The elevator rose in oppressive silence. Emily avoided her reflection in the mirrored walls, unable to face the woman staring back at her, pale, frightened, but determined. The black dress she wore felt too heavy, too tight, too wrong, but it was all she had. 23rd floor. The doors opened. Her feet moved automatically down the familiar hallway, each step sinking into the thick carpet as if she were walking in quicksand. Suite 2307. The door was slightly ajar. Emily pushed it open slowly. The suite was transformed. It was no longer the cold corporate space from 2 days ago. Now it was something completely different and infinitely more disturbing. Candles, dozens of them, scattered across tables and windowsills, creating dancing shadows on the walls. The scent of red roses filled the air, heavy and almost suffocating. There was an open bottle of champagne, 2 crystal glasses, and on the enormous windows the silk curtains had been drawn, turning the city view into a spectacle of distant lights. All of this should have been romantic. But to Emily it felt like a cruel performance. She took a step inside. And that's when she heard it. The sound of running water coming from the bathroom. He was there preparing himself. Emily closed her eyes, feeling panic rise in her throat. You can leave. You can still leave. But then the image of her father's face appeared in her mind. The tired looks of the factory workers, the children of Oak Ridge, who wouldn't have food on the table if the company closed. She stayed. The bathroom door opened, and Alexander Kane emerged, wearing only black pants and a white shirt with the first buttons undone. His hair was slightly damp, as if he'd just stepped out of the shower. He stopped when he saw her, his gray eyes traveling over her slowly, lingering on every curve, every line of the dress that hugged her body. "You came," he said, his voice lower than Emily remembered. "I said I would," she replied, lifting her chin, refusing to appear weak, even though inside she was falling apart. Alexander walked toward her with measured, deliberate steps. He stopped just inches away, so close that Emily could feel the heat emanating from his body, the smell of expensive soap and something else, something masculine and dangerous. "So you understand the terms," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Emily nodded, unable to trust her own voice. He raised his hand and she instinctively flinched, but Alexander only took a strand of her hair, sliding it between his fingers as if evaluating its texture. "1 month," he murmured. "Every night I want. You deny me nothing. And you save the company." Emily completed, her voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. "All the people, all the jobs, it's already done." He released her hair and went to the table, picking up a thick envelope. The papers were signed this morning. 15 million deposited in Hargrove Manufacturing's account. Complete restructuring. Your town is saved. Emily felt her legs weaken. It was already done. He hadn't even waited to see if she would come. He was certain, absolutely certain, that she would sell herself. Tears burned in her eyes, but she forced them back. "Then there's nothing more to discuss," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts. Alexander placed the envelope back on the table and turned to her, his eyes darkening with something Emily couldn't name. Desire, curiosity, or perhaps just possession. "Take off the dress." The words fell like stones in the silence. Emily froze. She knew this moment would come. She had mentally prepared herself during the entire trip, but now, standing before him, with those cold eyes on her, her body refused to obey. Her voice failed. "Take it off," he repeated, firmer this time, "or I'll do it for you." With trembling fingers, Emily brought her hands to her back, searching for the zipper. It slid down with a sound that seemed too loud in the silent suite. The dress loosened, falling from her shoulders. She let it drop, standing there in just the simple lingerie she wore, no lace or silk, just plain white cotton. Emily felt more exposed than ever in her life. Not just physically, emotionally, spiritually. Alexander took a step forward, then another until he was directly in front of her. He raised his hand, sliding his fingers along the line of her shoulder, down her arm, sending shivers across her entire skin. "You're trembling," he observed. "I'm cold." She lied. "No." He tilted his head, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. "You're afraid." Emily didn't respond. She couldn't. Alexander moved even closer until their bodies almost touched. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, "You don't need to be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you." But he was wrong, because in that moment, when his hands slid around her waist, pulling her against his chest, Emily realized the pain had already begun. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was dominant, possessive, as if he were claiming something that belonged to him. Emily remained rigid, her lips closed, her hands pressed against his chest in a futile gesture of resistance. But Alexander didn't stop. His hands moved up her back, unclasping her bra, with an ease that suggested practice. When it fell to the floor, Emily felt panic explode. "Wait." "No." He cut her off, his voice husky. "You agreed. Now it's my turn." He guided her to the bedroom where the enormous king-size bed waited, covered in immaculate white sheets that seemed to mock everything that was about to happen. Emily lay down, her body tense like a rope about to snap. Alexander stood beside the bed, removing his shirt, revealing a muscular torso, scars that told stories she would never know. When he lay down beside her, pulling her against him, Emily squeezed her eyes shut. "Just survive. Just survive." But as his hands explored her body, as he whispered things that should have sounded intimate but felt empty, something inside Emily broke, and the tears finally began to fall. Alexander felt the change before he even saw it. Emily's body, which was already tense under his hands, became completely rigid, like stone, like ice, like something dead, and then he heard it. A muffled sob followed by another and another. She was crying. He stopped immediately, rising up on his elbows to look at her. Emily lay beneath him, eyes squeezed shut, tears silently streaming down her temples and soaking the pillow. Her lips were trembling, and she was biting her lower lip so hard that Alexander saw a drop of blood. Something strange happened inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Maybe this, a pang, discomfort, almost like guilt. "Emily," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. She didn't respond, just kept crying silently as if she were somewhere else, disconnected from her own body. Alexander pulled away, sitting on the edge of the bed, running his hands through his hair. What the hell is happening? This was supposed to be simple, a transaction. She agreed. He paid. It should just be business. But seeing her there, broken, destroyed by something he was doing, it was different from everything he'd imagined. "Look at me," he ordered, but his voice came out softer than usual. Emily opened her eyes slowly. They were red, swollen, overflowing with a pain so deep that Alexander felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Why are you crying?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. Emily sat up, pulling the sheets to cover her body, her fingers clutching the fabric as if it were the only thing keeping her whole. She stared at him, and for the first time, there wasn't just fear in those eyes. There was anger, pure and incandescent. "Why am I crying?" she repeated, her voice breaking into a humorless laugh. "You're asking me why?" Alexander didn't respond. He just waited. "Because you're stealing something from me," Emily said, each word coming out like an accusation. "Something I never gave to anyone. Something I kept waiting for someone who would love me. For a moment, that would mean something." She stopped, wiping the tears with the back of her hand, but new ones kept falling. "But you don't care, do you? To you, this is just business. Just another conquest. Just another body." Alexander felt his jaw tighten. "You agreed." "I know I agreed." Her voice exploded, filling the silent suite. "I know, but that doesn't make this right. It doesn't make you any less of a monster for forcing me to choose between my dignity and the survival of 2,000 people." She climbed off the bed, stumbling as she picked up her clothes scattered across the floor. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely hold the dress. "You want to know the truth, Alexander Kane?" She turned to him, completely naked, vulnerable, but with a strength in her eyes that left him speechless. "I'm a virgin." The world stopped. Alexander stared at her, the words taking a moment to process. "Virgin." She was. "I've never been with anyone," Emily continued, her voice trembling, but firm. "I wanted my first time to be special. I wanted it to be with someone who saw me as more than an object, someone who cared." She took a step toward him, and Alexander realized he was instinctively backing away. "But you're stealing that from me. You're taking something that never existed before and turning it into a dirty transaction, into shame, into something I'll carry for the rest of my life." Her words were knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. "You think you're powerful," she continued, her voice rising again. "Think buying people makes you strong, makes you important?" Emily moved closer until she was inches from him, her eyes burning into his. "You're pathetic," she whispered, and the venom in those words burned more than any scream. "You're a man so broken, so empty that you need to destroy other people to feel anything, to feel alive." Alexander felt something break inside him, something deep, something he'd kept locked and buried for so long he'd forgotten it existed. "You're a monster," Emily said, and this time her voice was calm, certain. "And one day, when you're alone in all these luxury hotels, surrounded by everything you bought and no one who truly cares, you'll realize you destroyed the only thing that matters: humanity, connection, love." She picked up the dress and quickly put it on, not caring about the lingerie left behind. When she grabbed her purse, Alexander finally found his voice. "Wait." Emily stopped, but didn't turn around. He didn't know what to say. Apologies were for the weak. He'd learned that long ago. But the words came out anyway, torn from some dark place inside him. "I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" she asked, still with her back turned. "That I was a virgin, or that I was human?" Silence. Emily laughed again, that broken laugh without joy. "Keep your money, Alexander. Keep your company. I'll find another way." "There is no other way," he said, his voice sounding hollow, even to himself. "You know that." She finally turned around, and the look she gave him was one of pure pity. "Then I'll lose. But at least when I look in the mirror, I'll still recognize the person looking back." Emily walked to the door, her hand on the handle. Before leaving, she looked at him one last time. "I feel sorry for you," she said softly, "because you have everything, and you have nothing." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Alexander was alone. The suite, which minutes ago had seemed intimate and prepared, now felt empty. The candles still burned. The roses still perfumed the air, but everything seemed fake, artificial, dead. He walked to the window, looking at the city below. Millions of lights, millions of lives, all continuing as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. For the first time in 15 years, Alexander Kane looked at himself through someone else's eyes. And what he saw disgusted him. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, closing his eyes. And for the first time since his father abandoned him when he was 12, Alexander felt something wet slide down his cheek. A tear, followed by another, and another. Alone in the luxury suite, surrounded by everything his money could buy, and nothing that truly mattered. The most powerful man in Chicago finally broke. Alexander didn't sleep that night. He sat on the suite sofa, staring into emptiness while the candles slowly consumed themselves into pools of melted wax. The champagne bottle remained untouched, the empty glasses reflecting the faint light from the city outside. The silence was deafening, so heavy he could almost hear the echoes of Emily's words reverberating off the walls. "You're a monster. You're pathetic. I feel sorry for you." Each phrase was an open wound, bleeding truths he'd spent his entire life avoiding. Alexander brought his hands to his face, pressing his palms against his eyes as if he could erase the images. Emily crying beneath him, her body rigid with fear, her eyes red and accusing, piercing through all his defenses. Virgin, the word haunted him. He had almost taken that from her, almost destroyed something precious, irreplaceable. For what? For power? To prove he could have whatever he wanted? No. For the first time, Alexander forced himself to face the truth. For loneliness. The clock read 4 inches the morning when he finally stood up, his legs numb from being still for so long. He walked to the bathroom, washed his face with ice-cold water, and stared at his reflection in the huge mirror. The man looking back was unrecognizable. Sunken dark eyes, disheveled hair, an expression he hadn't seen since when? Since he was 12. Maybe sitting on the stairs of an empty house, waiting for a father who never came back. Alexander closed his eyes and the memories came like a flood. "You're nothing, Alexander. You never will be." His father's voice echoed through the years. "Love is weakness. Trust is stupidity. The only real power is in money and control." His father, Edward Kane, was a brilliant and cruel man, a businessman who built an empire on the bodies of people who trusted him. When his wife, Alexander's mother, left him, taking only a suitcase and a broken heart, Edward didn't cry. He just smiled. "See, boy, that's why you can never love. Love makes you vulnerable." And Alexander believed it. He absorbed every poisonous word like gospel, built walls so high around his heart that even he couldn't climb them, turned himself into a younger, more ruthless version of his father. Until tonight. Until Emily Hargrove looked at him with those tear-filled eyes and said the one thing no one had ever dared say, "You're pathetic." And she was right. Alexander left the bathroom, grabbed his phone, and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Ellis and Partners Law Office. A sleepy voice answered. "It's Alexander Kane. I need you to prepare documents now." "Mr. Kane, it's 4:00 inches the morning. Now," he repeated with the voice he usually used to end discussions. 2 hours later, the documents were ready. Alexander read them 3 times, making sure every clause was perfect, every word clear. Then he signed. Hargrove Manufacturing wouldn't be bought. It would be saved. 15 million in direct investment. 0 equity stake required from Emily or her father. 0 obligations. 0 strings attached. It was a gift, pure and simple. Or maybe, Alexander admitted to himself, as he watched the sun rise over Chicago, it wasn't a gift. It was penance. When he returned to Oak Ridge 3 days later, the town was plunged in an early snowstorm. Thick flakes fell from the gray sky, covering the narrow streets with a white blanket that made everything quiet and clean, as if nature itself was offering a fresh start. Alexander drove through the familiar streets, observing the small town he would never have looked at twice under normal circumstances. But now every detail caught his attention. The bakery with smoke coming from the chimney, children making snowmen in front of the school. The old gas station where a man in coveralls greeted each customer by name. This was community, something he'd never had, something Emily was willing to sacrifice everything to protect. Hargrove Manufacturing Factory was on the outskirts of town, a faded red brick building with the company name in large, proud letters. Alexander parked in front, took a deep breath, and walked in. The interior was modest but clean, well-maintained machinery. The smell of oil and metal. The sound of honest work. Workers greeted each other, laughing, sharing coffee and old mugs. Alexander felt completely out of place. "Can I help you?" A woman in her 50s, gray hair pulled back in a bun, looked at him with polite curiosity. "I'm looking for Robert Hargrove, office at the end of the hall." She pointed, then tilted her head. "You're Alexander Kane." Her expression changed instantly. Surprise, followed by something that looked like gratitude. "You're the investor. You saved this place." Alexander didn't know what to say. He just nodded and walked down the hallway. Robert Hargrove was sitting behind a desk covered in papers, his face tired, but less defeated than Alexander expected. When he looked up and saw Alexander, he stood abruptly, knocking a pen over in the process. "Mr. Kane, I didn't expect I came personally to discuss the investment terms," Alexander interrupted, his voice returning to the professional tone he knew so well. "I'd like to stay for a month, personally oversee the restructuring." Robert blinked, clearly shocked. "A month? Here in Oak Ridge?" "Yes." Alexander placed his briefcase on the desk. "I want to make sure every penny is used correctly, that every job is preserved." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. The truth was that Alexander couldn't go back to Chicago. Not yet, not when that hotel suite, the entire city was contaminated by memories of who he'd been, and maybe, just maybe, staying in Oak Ridge, seeing what Emily was willing to destroy herself to protect, could teach him something. Could teach him how to be human again. Robert extended his hand, still a bit uncertain. "Welcome to Hargrove Manufacturing, Mr. Kane." Alexander shook his hand, feeling the calluses from years of manual labor. "Call me Alexander." And for the first time in 15 years, the name sounded right. When he left the office, he passed the same gray-haired woman. "Is Emily here today?" he asked before he could stop himself. The woman smiled. "She's in warehouse 3 checking inventory." Alexander nodded and walked in the indicated direction, his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with business. Because this time, when he saw Emily Hargrove, it wouldn't be as a conqueror, it would be as a man trying to figure out if he still deserved forgiveness. Emily had her back turned when Alexander entered Warehouse 3. She wore faded jeans, heavy work boots, and a thick sweater that hid her curves. But even so, something inside him reacted to the sight. It wasn't lust. Or at least it wasn't just lust. It was something deeper, more disturbing, recognition perhaps, as if this ordinary woman, with her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and a clipboard in her hands, was more real than anyone he'd ever known. She was counting stacked boxes, her lips moving silently as she made notes. The dim light of the warehouse created soft shadows on her face, and Alexander noticed there were dark circles under her eyes. She wasn't sleeping either. Because of him, he cleared his throat. Emily turned so quickly she almost dropped the clipboard. When her eyes met his, Alexander saw everything: shock, anger, fear, and something else. She quickly hid behind a mask of coldness. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I came to oversee the investment," Alexander replied, keeping his voice neutral, professional. "I'll be in Oak Ridge for a month." The color drained from Emily's face. "A month?" "Yes. I want to make sure." "No." She shook her head, taking a step back. "No, you can't be here." "You can't, Alexander." He raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I didn't come for that. I came for business. Just business." She stared at him, her eyes searching for signs of lies, of manipulation. Alexander forced himself to remain still, letting her look. Finally, Emily exhaled slowly. "If you touch me," she said, her voice low, but deadly, "I will scream, and I don't care how many millions you invested. This entire town will come down on you like a storm." "I won't touch you," Alexander said, and for the first time, he really meant it. "You have my word." She laughed without humor. "Your word means nothing to me yet," he thought, "but maybe one day it will." The following days were strange and tense. Alexander rented a small apartment above the town's main coffee shop, a modest space that would have horrified his week-ago self, but now seemed fitting. He spent his mornings at the factory reviewing financial reports, talking with suppliers, learning the names of every employee, and watching Emily, not in a predatory way, not like before, but with genuine curiosity. She was different here in her element, confident, without arrogance, kind to younger employees, patient when explaining processes, firm when making decisions. People respected her not out of fear, but out of love. Alexander had never seen anything like it. One morning, he found her in the storage room, struggling to reach a box on a high shelf. She was on her tiptoes, fingers grazing the edge, but unable to grab it. "Let me help," he said, appearing behind her. Emily turned, almost colliding with his chest. "I don't need your," but Alexander was already reaching over her, grabbing the box easily. As he did, his body pressed lightly against her back, and for a second, just 1 second, time stopped. He could feel her warmth through their clothes. He could hear her breathing quicken. He could smell the lavender shampoo she used. Alexander placed the box on the floor and quickly stepped back as if he'd been burned. "Sorry," he murmured. Emily didn't respond. She just grabbed the box and hurried out. Her cheeks flushed, but Alexander saw it, saw the way she held her breath, the way her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the box. She had felt it too. Days turned into weeks. Alexander forced himself to keep his distance, but it was impossible not to notice the small moments, when she laughed with an employee and the light reached her eyes, when she bit her lower lip, concentrating on a report, when she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear, and he knew with disturbing certainty that he was beginning to see her as more than a transaction, more than someone he almost destroyed. He was beginning to see her as Emily. One day, passing her in the narrow hallway between offices, Alexander stopped. "Emily?" She turned, cautious. "Yes." He opened his mouth, not knowing exactly what he was going to say. Apologies seemed inadequate. Explanations seemed empty. So he simply said, "You're doing a great job here with the restructuring." "With the people?" Emily blinked, clearly surprised. "Thank you. I'm serious." Alexander took a step closer, not invasive, just enough for her to see his eyes. "You have a gift for leadership, for making people care." Something changed in her face. The distrust was still there, but now there was a crack in the armor. "Why are you saying this?" "Because it's true," he paused, "and because I was wrong about you. About everything." Emily studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching for something Alexander didn't even know if he could give. "People don't change, Alexander," she said finally, her voice soft but sad. "Especially not people like you." "Maybe you're right," he admitted, "but maybe some people just need a reason to try." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her alone in the hallway. But that night, when Alexander was reviewing papers in his small apartment, he heard a knock on the door. He opened it, and there stood Emily wrapped in a thick coat, snow clinging to her hair. "Have you eaten?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Alexander shook his head. "Mrs. Patel from the coffee shop downstairs made too much and gave me leftovers." Emily held up a bag. I thought, well, it would be a waste to throw it away. It wasn't an invitation, not exactly. But it was something. Alexander opened the door wider, gesturing for her to come in. "I'd love to." And as they shared reheated Chinese food on mismatched plates, sitting on the floor because the apartment barely had furniture, something changed between them. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something that could become forgiveness if he could prove he deserved it. The news spread through Oak Ridge like wildfire. Alexander Kane, the billionaire from Chicago, had made a massive donation to the local orphanage, Hope House for Children, $50,000 for renovations, new toys for all the children, and most impressive, a permanent monthly fund to ensure no child would ever go without. Emily heard about it first at Mrs. Patel's coffee shop, where half the town seemed to be discussing the generous news over breakfast. "He didn't even ask for publicity," Mrs. Whitaker from the bakery was saying, her eyes wide with admiration. "He just showed up with a check and said he wanted to help." "My grandson is at that orphanage," old Hank added, wiping his moist eyes. "For the first time in years, that boy is going to have a real Christmas." Emily felt something uncomfortable stir in her stomach. Confusion maybe, or worse, hope. She grabbed her coffee and left quickly, but couldn't stop thinking. Why would he do this? Alexander didn't do anything without a reason. Everything was calculated, strategic. So, what was the angle? This time she found the answer. Or part of it. That afternoon, Emily was delivering documents to her father's office when she saw through the window Alexander getting out of a black car in front of Hope House just a few blocks away. He was carrying large boxes, and even from a distance, she could see children running toward him. Something pulled at her, a need to understand, to see with her own eyes. She left the papers on her father's desk and walked to the orphanage, her heart racing for no clear reason. When she arrived, she stood outside the iron fence, watching through the bars. Alexander was surrounded by children. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, was clinging to his leg, laughing. An older boy was showing him a drawing. Others were tearing into the boxes, screaming with joy as they found toys, games, books, and Alexander was smiling, not the cold, calculated smile Emily knew. It was genuine, reaching his eyes, making his face completely different, younger, more human. He knelt down to be at eye level with a small girl with dark braids and big sad eyes. "What's your name?" Alexander asked gently. "Lily," the girl whispered, hugging a worn teddy bear. "Lily," Alexander repeated as if memorizing it. "That's a beautiful name. Are you leaving?" Lily asked, her voice so small Emily could barely hear. "Everyone always leaves." Alexander's expression changed. Something passed through his eyes. Pain, recognition, memory. "I'm going to stay for a while," he said, reaching out to gently touch her hair. "I promise." Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She was seeing something she shouldn't, something private, vulnerable. She was about to turn away when Alexander looked up and his eyes met hers through the bars. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Alexander stood up, said something to the children, and walked toward the gate. Emily thought about running, but her feet didn't obey. "Did you follow me?" he asked when he got close. But there was no accusation in his voice, just curiosity. "I saw you from the window," Emily admitted, "and I needed to understand why." "Why? What? Why you did this?" She gestured toward the orphanage. "The donation, the renovations. Why?" Alexander put his hands in his pockets, looking back at the children playing. "Because I was once one of those kids." Emily blinked, surprised. "What?" "When my mother left my father, he wasn't exactly father material." Alexander's voice was distant, as if he were telling someone else's story. "I'd go days alone, no food, no supervision. The neighbors called social services 3 times before I turned 10. Emily felt something shift inside her, a crack in the image she had of him. "I was never officially placed in an orphanage," Alexander continued. "My father could always convince them he'd change. But I remember visiting one once, a cold, gray place, where the children had eyes like lilies. Empty, waiting for someone, anyone, to care." He finally looked at Emily. "So, to answer your question, I did this because I can and because no one did it for me." Emily didn't know what to say. Every word she thought of seemed inadequate. But she started, then stopped. "But," Alexander prompted. "But you're not trying to change," Emily said, the frustration returning. "You're trying to get applause. Buy redemption with a check." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Is that what you think of me? I don't know what to think of you." Emily's voice came out louder than she intended. "One moment you're doing that horrible thing in Chicago, and the next moment you're here playing with orphan children. Who are you, Alexander?" He took a step closer, and Emily forced herself not to back away. "I'm trying to figure that out," he said, his voice low and intense. "For the first time in my life, I don't know who I am. And maybe you're right. Maybe I'm just trying to buy forgiveness. But at least I'm trying. Trying isn't enough. Then what is?" Alexander challenged her. "What do I need to do to prove I'm not just the monster you saw in that suite?" Emily stared at him, her heart pounding. "I don't know if you can." Silence fell between them, heavy and painful. Finally, Alexander nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right. But I'm going to try anyway." He walked back to the orphanage, leaving Emily alone outside the gates. But as she walked back to the factory, she couldn't get the image out of her head. Alexander kneeling in front of little Lily, gently touching her hair, promising to stay, and for the first time, Emily wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than she'd allowed herself to see, or if she was just being foolish again. That night, lying in bed, Emily looked at the ceiling and whispered to the darkness, "Who are you really, Alexander Kane?" And somewhere across town in a small apartment above a coffee shop, Alexander was asking himself the same question. 2 weeks had passed since the donation to the orphanage, and something had changed in the air between Emily and Alexander. It wasn't trust. Not yet. It was more like a hesitant truce. A silent acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, there was more to their story than a terrible beginning. Alexander continued working at the factory, but now Emily caught him looking at her with a different expression. It wasn't the predatory gaze from Chicago. It was curiosity, admiration, even as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. And Emily, no matter how much she tried to deny it, found herself looking back. She noticed things now. The way Alexander leaned in to listen when an employee spoke, really listening, instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. How he stayed late reviewing budgets to make sure each department had what it needed. How he visited the orphanage 3 times a week, always bringing something small, books, candy, sometimes just his time. "You're different," Emily said one afternoon when they found themselves alone in the filing office, searching for old contracts. Alexander looked up, surprised. "Different? How?" Emily hesitated, then decided to be honest. "More human." He laughed, a short sound without humor. "Thanks. I think. I didn't mean it that way." Emily put the folder she was holding back on the shelf. "It's just in Chicago. You were like a machine, cold, calculating. But I'm trying to be better." Alexander interrupted gently. He moved closer, stopping on the other side of the narrow table. "You showed me who I'd become, and I didn't like what I saw." Emily felt something tighten in her chest. "People don't change overnight, Alexander. I know." He held her gaze. "But they can try every day until one day the trying becomes who they are." There was something in his eyes, raw, vulnerable sincerity, that made Emily look away first. "I need to go," she murmured, moving quickly past him. But as she did, the sleeve of her blouse caught on the edge of the table. Pulling her back, Alexander instinctively reached out to steady her, his hands gripping her shoulders. They froze. Emily could feel the warmth of his palms through the thin fabric, could hear his breathing slightly quickened. They were so close, she saw the golden flecks in his gray eyes, details she'd never noticed before. "Sorry," Alexander whispered, but didn't release her immediately. "It's okay," Emily replied, her voice coming out huskier than she intended. For a moment, just one moment, she allowed herself to wonder what it would be like if everything were different. If they had met another way. If there was no Chicago, no terrible proposal, no shame between them, then reality returned and she stepped away. "I really need to go." Alexander let his hands drop. "Emily, wait." She stopped at the door without turning. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow night?" Emily finally looked at him. "Why?" "Because I'd like to get to know you," Alexander said simply. "The real you. Not the desperate woman in Chicago. Not the executive here at the factory. Just Emily." She should say no. Every instinct screamed to say no. But when she opened her mouth, she heard herself say, "Where?" A small, hopeful smile touched his lips. "Leave it to me." The next night, Alexander showed up at the Hargrove house door, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, none of the expensive suits he wore in Chicago. He held a small bouquet of wild flowers he'd clearly picked himself. "These are for you," he said, holding them out to Emily. She took the flowers, feeling something strange and warm expand in her chest. No one had ever given her flowers before. "Thank you." The restaurant was a small Italian place on Main Street. Nothing fancy. Just 20 tables with red and white checkered tablecloths. The smell of garlic and basil in the air. Alexander chose a corner table away from curious eyes. "Why here?" Emily asked as they sat down. "Because I didn't want to impress you with money," Alexander replied. "I already tried that. It didn't work out so well." Despite herself, Emily smiled. Dinner started awkwardly, full of strange silences and conversations about safe topics. The weather, the factory, Oak Ridge. But when the wine arrived, a simple red the owner recommended, something changed. "Tell me about your mother," Emily said suddenly. Alexander stopped with his glass halfway to his lips. "Why?" "Because you mentioned she left, and I want to understand." He put the glass back on the table, his fingers tracing the rim. "She was kind," he said finally, always smiling, "even when my father made her cry. I remember once, when I was 6, and he broke all her dishes because dinner was late. She cleaned everything up silently and then took me outside, and we had a picnic on the grass with sandwiches." His voice grew thicker. "The day she left, she hugged me and said, 'I love you, Alex. Never forget that you deserve to be loved.' Then she left and I never saw her again." Emily felt tears burn in her eyes. "How old were you?" 12. "Did you try to find her?" "Every day for the first 5 years." Alexander finally looked up, his eyes glistening. "Then I gave up. If she really loved me, she would have come back." "Alexander, my father told me love is a lie," he continued, the words coming out like a confession, "that the only real things are power and control. So I built my entire life around that, built walls so high nothing could hurt me. Until Chicago," Emily whispered. "Until you." Alexander reached his hand across the table, stopping before touching hers. "You broke those walls with one sentence. You're pathetic. No one ever had the courage to tell me the truth before." Emily looked at his hand so close to hers. "And now, Now I'm learning that maybe my father was wrong. That maybe love isn't weakness." He turned his palm up, a silent offer. Emily looked at that hand, the same hand that had almost destroyed her, but now held wild flowers and open doors for orphaned children. And slowly, her heart pounding, she placed her hand in his. Alexander's fingers closed gently around hers, warm and firm. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For giving me a chance." They finished dinner, holding hands, talking about things that mattered, dreams, fears, regrets. When they left, the snow had started falling again, turning Oak Ridge into a winter fairy tale. Alexander walked her home, moving slowly, as if he didn't want the night to end. When they reached the front door, both stopped. "Emily," Alexander said, his voice low and intense. "Yes, I can't pretend I don't feel anything anymore." Emily's heart leaped. "Alexander, I know I have no right." He took a step closer, his eyes pleading. "I know I started this in the worst possible way, but when I look at you now, I see everything I've always wanted and never thought I deserved." He raised his hand, hesitating, then gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You make me want to be better, to be worthy, to be loved." Emily couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she felt was his touch, warm against her skin, and the look in his eyes, vulnerable, hopeful, scared. "Can I?" He leaned in slightly, a silent question. Emily knew she should say no, knew it was too soon, too fast, too risky. But when she opened her mouth, a single word came out. "Yes." Alexander leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind. His hands framed her face with a tenderness that made her want to cry. And then his lips touched hers. It was nothing like Emily imagined it would be. It wasn't demanding or possessive. It was soft, questioning, almost reverent, as if he were savoring something precious that could break. Emily felt herself melting, her hands rising to grip his sweater, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and she could feel years of his loneliness flowing through the touch. Hunger not for a body, but for connection, for being seen, for mattering. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "Wow," Emily whispered. Alexander smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Yeah. Wow." He pressed his forehead against hers. Eyes closed. "Good night, Emily. Good night." He stepped away reluctantly and descended the steps, stopping to look back once before disappearing into the snow. Emily went inside, leaning against the closed door, her heart still racing, her lips still tingling. And for the first time since Chicago, she allowed herself to think, maybe he really can change. Maybe we both can. 3 days had passed since the kiss. 3 days of stolen glances at the factory, of fingers brushing as they passed papers, of conversations that lasted until late at night in text messages that made Emily smile in the dark. Alexander was different now. Or maybe Emily was just allowing herself to see him differently. He laughed more, touched her arm lightly when passing by, brought coffee in the morning, just the way she liked it, with just a bit of sugar and lots of cream. And Emily was falling. She tried to fight it, tried to remember Chicago, the sweet, the cruel words, but every time she looked at Alexander now, she only saw the man who knelt to talk with orphaned children, the man who stayed late helping employees with personal problems, the man whose eyes lit up when she entered the room. On the 5th night after the kiss, Alexander showed up at her door again, but this time there was something different in his eyes, an intensity that made Emily's stomach tighten. "Hi," she said, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "Hi." He swallowed hard. Can I come in?" Emily stepped aside, letting him pass. He stood in the small living room, hands in his pockets, clearly nervous. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No, Alexander ran his hand through his hair. "I needed to see you, to be near you." Emily felt something warm spread through her chest. "You saw me today all day at the factory." "I know." He finally looked her in the eyes. "But it's not the same. There we have to pretend we're just colleagues. But when I'm here with you, I can just be me." He took a step toward her, and Emily didn't back away. "Emily," he whispered, raising his hand to lightly touch her face. "I can't stop thinking about you, about us, about how all of this started so wrong. But somehow it's starting to feel right." His thumb traced her cheek, moving down to her lower lip. "I want to know you," he continued, his voice husky. "For real. Not just conversations and dinners. I want to know how you breathe when you're sleeping. I want to know what sound you make when you really laugh. I want to know." He paused, his eyes darkening. "I want to know what it's like to love you, the way you deserve to be loved." Emily's heart beat so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Alexander, if you're not ready," he said quickly, "I understand." I would wait a lifetime if Emily silenced him with a kiss. It was different from the first. This one was urgent, hungry, full of weeks of built-up tension and repressed desire. Her hands rose to his hair, pulling him closer, and Alexander groaned against her lips. "Are you sure?" he asked between kisses, his hands sliding around her waist. "Because if we start this, I don't know if I can stop." "I'm sure," Emily whispered, looking into his eyes. "And it's you I want." Something changed in his expression, as if she'd just given him the greatest gift in the world. Alexander picked her up in one fluid motion, making her wrap her legs around his waist. He carried her to her bedroom, kissing her the entire way, as if he couldn't bear to be without her lips for even a second. When he laid her on the bed, he paused, looking at her with a reverence that brought tears to Emily's eyes. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, kneeling beside the bed. "And I'm so lucky." He started slowly. Each button of her blouse was undone carefully, his fingers brushing the skin being revealed. When the blouse finally fell away, he kissed her, not in a hurry, but savoring. Her shoulders, the curve of her neck, the valley between her breasts. "Alexander," Emily breathed, her fingers burying in his hair. "I know," he whispered against her skin. "I feel it too." He helped her remove the rest of her clothes, each piece removed as if unwrapping something precious. And when she was completely naked before him, Alexander simply looked, his eyes traveling over every curve, every line. "Perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're absolutely perfect." Emily pulled him up, helping him remove his own clothes until there was nothing between them. Skin against skin, heart against heart. Alexander lay beside her, one hand tracing lazy patterns on her stomach, rising to outline her breasts, making her arch against the touch. "Tell me what you want," he murmured, his lips brushing her ear. "You," Emily whispered, "just you." He kissed her deeply while his hands explored, learning every inch of her. When his fingers slid between her thighs, Emily moaned, her entire body trembling with sensations she'd never felt before. "Are you okay?" Alexander asked, his eyes seeking hers. "Yes," she gasped. "Don't stop. Please don't stop." He worked her slowly, patiently, until she was trembling and desperate. Only then did he position himself over her, his eyes meeting hers. "This might hurt at first," he warned gently. "Tell me if you want me to stop." Emily nodded, pulling him into a kiss. Alexander entered slowly, so slowly that Emily wanted to cry at the restraint she saw on his face. There was a moment of discomfort, a sharp pressure, and she winced. He froze immediately. "Emily, I'm okay," she promised, wrapping her legs around him. "Keep going." He moved in tiny increments, giving her time to adjust, kissing her through the discomfort, until gradually, miraculously, it began to feel good, better than good, amazing. "Oh," Emily gasped when he was finally completely inside her. "Oh my God." Alexander let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, exactly." He began to move, and it was like nothing Emily had ever imagined. Each thrust sent waves of pleasure through her. Each kiss deepened the connection. Each whisper of her name made her feel seen, valued, loved. "Emily," Alexander groaned, his face buried in her neck. You're everything." His hands were everywhere, in her hair, on her breasts, gripping her hips. As the rhythm increased, Emily scratched him, pulled him, drank in every sensation as if she were dying of thirst. "Alexander," she whimpered when she felt something building inside her. I don't know what." "Let go," he whispered, one hand sliding between them to touch where their bodies joined. "I've got you. Let go." And she did. The orgasm hit her like a wave, making her entire body shake and contract. She cried out his name, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was suddenly spinning. Alexander followed moments later, his body stiffening as he found his own release, his face a mask of pleasure and something deeper, something that looked suspiciously like love. Afterward, lying tangled in the sheets, heart still racing, Alexander pulled her against his chest. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her back as he kissed her hair. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Emily rested her head on his shoulder, smiling. "More than okay. No regrets?" She lifted her head to look him in the eyes. "None." "You?" Alexander held her face in his hands, his eyes so intense, she felt like he could see straight into her soul. "How could I regret the best moment of my life?" He kissed her again, slow and deep, and Emily felt something settle inside her, something that felt a lot like peace. "You're different," she said when they parted. "Different? How?" "Lighter. Like something heavy you were carrying finally went away." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "Because it did," he finally said. "I spent years building walls, convinced I needed them to survive. But you," he pressed his forehead against hers, "you showed me the walls weren't protecting me. They were just imprisoning me. And for the first time since I was a child, I feel free." Emily felt tears burn in her eyes. "Me too," she whispered. They fell asleep like that, curled into each other, bodies and souls intertwined, and when morning came, bringing soft light through the curtains, Alexander woke first. He lay watching Emily sleep, a strand of hair fallen across her face, her lips slightly parted, and he knew with a certainty that both scared and thrilled him. "I love this woman, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving I deserve her love." The following days were like living in a dream. Alexander and Emily no longer hid their relationship. The entire town knew, and surprisingly, they approved. Mrs. Patel smiled knowingly when she saw them together at the coffee shop. Old Hank patted Alexander on the shoulder with approval. Even Emily's father, Robert, who had initially been suspicious, began to see the genuine change in the billionaire. "Does he make you happy?" Robert asked one evening when Emily was helping wash the dinner dishes. "Yes, Dad," she replied, unable to contain her smile. "He makes me very happy." Robert nodded slowly. "Then he has my blessing. But if he hurts you, he won't," Emily interrupted, surprising herself with her own certainty. And she really believed it. The Alexander who shared her breakfast, who read to children at the orphanage, who held her hand as they walked through snow-covered streets, this man was incapable of hurting her. But then, in the third week, Alexander disappeared. Emily woke up one Saturday morning expecting to find him next to her in bed. He had spent every night there since the first time. But the space was empty, the sheets cold. She checked his apartment. Empty. The factory. He wasn't there. She called his cell phone dozens of times, but it just went to voicemail. On the second day, panic began to set in. He left. Of course, he did. This was too good to be true. Emily sat on the bench in the square, where she had called him months ago, accepting that terrible proposal, and let the tears fall. She had been foolish. She had believed that people like Alexander really changed. Emily? She looked up and saw Mrs. Whitaker from the bakery with a strange expression on her face. "Have you seen the news?" "What news?" The woman held out her phone, showing an article. The headline made Emily's heart stop. "Billionaire Alexander Kane adopts Oak Ridge orphan." Emily read the article with trembling hands. Alexander had gone to Chicago, not to run away, but to finalize adoption papers. Lily, the little girl with dark braids and sad eyes from the orphanage, was now legally his daughter. Kane, known for his ruthless business reputation, shocked the corporate world with the decision, the article read. When asked about his motivation, he simply said, "I learned that real power isn't in how much you can take, but in how much you can give." Emily put down the phone, tears now falling for a completely different reason. 3 hours later, a black car stopped in front of her house. Alexander got out holding Lily's hand, who wore a new dress and held a teddy bear even bigger than the previous one. Emily ran down the stairs, stopping a few feet from them. You adopted her," she said, her voice breaking. Alexander smiled. That genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "I should have told you," he admitted, "but I wanted to make sure everything was finalized before getting her hopes up. Or yours." Lily partially hid behind Alexander, but peeked at Emily with curiosity. "Lily," Alexander said gently, kneeling beside her. "This is Emily. She's very special to me. Do you think you can say hi?" "Hi," Lily whispered. Emily knelt too, getting to the girl's eye level. "Hi. Lily, do you remember me?" "I visited the orphanage a few times." Lily nodded shyly. "You're pretty." Emily laughed through her tears. "Thank you. You are too." Alexander watched them interact, something expanding in his chest. "My family," he thought. "They're my family." In the following days, Alexander worked tirelessly to create a home for Lily. He rented a small but cozy house on the outskirts of Oak Ridge. Nothing like the mansions he owned, but perfect for a girl who needed warmth, not grandeur. Emily helped decorate, choosing pink curtains and wallpaper with stars. She taught Alexander how to braid hair, how to read bedtime stories, how to simply be present, and slowly, miraculously, Lily began to blossom. Her eyes, once empty, began to shine. She laughed, a loud, joyful laugh that made Alexander want to cry every time he heard it. She called Emily Miss Emily with a sweet reverence that melted her heart. One night, 2 months after the adoption, Alexander showed up at Emily's door, with Lily already asleep in his arms. She insisted on coming to see you before bed, he explained, but she fell asleep on the way. Emily let them in, watching as Alexander gently placed Lily on the sofa, covering her with a blanket. When he turned around, Emily was waiting. "I need to tell you something," she said. Alexander pulled her close, his hands resting on her waist. "What?" "I love you." The words came out simple, direct, true. Alexander froze, his eyes wide. "What?" "I love you," Emily repeated, holding his face in her hands. "I fought against it. I tried to convince myself it was too soon, too fast, but I can't deny it anymore. I love the man you've become. I love the father you are to Lily. I love." He silenced her with a kiss, desperate, grateful, full of all the emotion he didn't know how to express with words. When they parted, both were crying. "I love you too," Alexander whispered against her lips. "I've loved you since the moment you called me pathetic and made me face who I really was. You saved me, Emily. Saved me from myself. We saved each other," she corrected. The next morning when Emily woke up, she found a small box on the nightstand with a note, "Would you have breakfast with me? And every breakfast after that forever, A." Inside the box was a simple ring, not extravagant, not ostentatious, just a delicate gold band with a small diamond. Emily found him in the kitchen making pancakes with Lily, who was covered in flour and laughing. "Yes," Emily said. Alexander turned around, his eyes hopeful. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Yes to every breakfast. Yes to everything." Lily screamed with joy, jumping up and down. "Does this mean Miss Emily is going to live with us?" Alexander swept Emily into his arms, spinning her. "This means we're a family." Alexander Kane had everything: power, money, control. But it was only when he lost control, when a courageous young woman made him face the monster in the mirror, that he discovered what it really means to have everything. Because in the end, it's not the millions that define us. It's the small hands we hold, the hearts we choose to protect, the love we decide to deserve, even when we think we deserve nothing. Emily taught Alexander that redemption isn't something you buy. It's something you earn every day with each choice to be better than who you were yesterday. And maybe that's the most powerful truth. None of us is beyond saving. No beginning is so dark that it can't transform into light. Sometimes the most beautiful stories are born from the ashes of our worst mistakes. And maybe deep down this story also speaks to us about second chances, about forgiveness, about believing that people can change when they finally find a reason to try,